Alexander Kane was a man used to whispers. They trailed after him like shadows, low voices curling through gilded rooms and marble hallways. He didn't have to hear every word to know their contents, half-truths, cruel observations, guesses at how much his net worth had climbed that year. They always came with glances, too, quick and sharp, and then the inevitable flicker of pity or revulsion before eyes darted away. At 42, he had the kind of power most men would kill for. Billionaire real estate tycoon, skyscraper owner, ruthless negotiator whose very name could close a deal. But power didn't make him wanted, not in the ways that mattered. The newspapers had given him names over the years. The Ice King, the coldest man alive. Those who had met him privately knew the truth. He was blunt, uninterested in flattery, and utterly unwilling to pretend. The kind of man who didn't do smiles unless they were earned. And then there was the scar. It ran from the top of his left cheekbone to just past his jawline, deep and pale against his olive-toned skin. A teenage car accident, his fault, though no one else had been hurt. He'd been handsome once, the kind of boy who could charm his way into any heart. The scar changed everything. First, the way people looked at him. Then, the way he looked at himself. Women hadn't stopped showing interest. Money had a way of attracting company, but the warmth had vanished. Every smile was transactional, every hand on his arm calculating. He learned quickly to read motives and just as quickly to keep his own heart locked away. Relationships didn't end with heartbreak for him. They ended with the cold realization that the other person had never loved him in the first place. Tonight was no different. The 50th birthday of Daniel Whitmore, one of the few friends Alexander still kept. Daniel was the kind of man who collected friends like fine wine, generous, charismatic, effortlessly likable. Their friendship went back decades, forged in business before Alexander's scar and the shell he'd built around himself. The party was being held at an exclusive rooftop hotel in Manhattan, the kind of place with endless champagne, a string quartet playing modern covers, and a view of the city that could take your breath away. Alexander arrived late, as he always did, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and an expression that discouraged small talk. He had every intention of making his appearance, giving Daniel his gift, and slipping out before the crowd grew too curious about his personal life. He was halfway across the rooftop when it happened. 1 second he was moving toward the bar, the next a small figure backed straight into him, nearly sending a camera clattering to the ground. Reflexes honed by years of calculated self-control kept his hands steady as he caught both the woman and the camera strap before disaster struck. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, turning quickly. "I didn't see you." The words stopped mid-breath as their eyes met. Alexander braced himself for it. The flicker, the quick scan of his face, the telltale dip in expression. But it didn't come. Her gaze didn't dart away. She didn't try to pretend she hadn't noticed his scar, nor did she linger on it with curiosity. She simply looked at him, straight and steady, as if his face were the most natural thing in the world. She was stunning. Skin like warm bronze under the rooftop lights, high cheekbones, a graceful neck, eyes deep and alert as though she could read a room in a heartbeat. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant knot, and though she wore a simple black dress that allowed her to move freely, she carried herself with quiet poise. Alexander found himself speaking before he meant to. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, smiling. Not a polite society smile, but a genuine one that softened her entire face. "Thank you for catching my camera. That would have been, well, expensive." He glanced at the camera in her hands. "Photographer?" "Freelance," she replied, "covering the event for the Whitmores. I was just trying to get a wide shot of the skyline. Guess I should have looked before stepping back." Her voice was warm, low, and unhurried. She didn't rush the conversation, didn't fill it with the kind of meaningless chatter people often threw at him to mask discomfort. And she wasn't impressed. Not by him, not by his suit, not by the quiet way the crowd seemed to part around them. "Alexander Kane," he said, extending a hand. "Priska Wilfred." she replied, shaking it firmly. Her grip was confident, not dainty or hesitant. For a moment, they simply stood there, the sounds of the party drifting around them. He was unused to this kind of ease with strangers, especially women. There was no angle in her eyes, no flicker toward his wallet or the weight of his watch. She was present, focused. "Well, Ms. Wilfred," he said at last, "I'll let you get back to your skyline. And I'll try not to run into anyone else," she said with a quick grin before stepping away, camera in hand. He watched her go, the steady rhythm of her steps, the way she moved through the crowd without posturing. She was working, yes, but it was more than that. There was something grounded about her, a kind of warmth he hadn't been near in years. The rest of the evening passed as he had planned. Brief conversation with Daniel, a glass of champagne he didn't finish, polite nods to acquaintances. But his eyes kept finding her, catching her in corners of the rooftop as she adjusted lenses, leaned over railings for better shots, or spoke briefly with guests. Each time she seemed fully engaged in whatever she was doing, unbothered by the glittering display of wealth around her. By the time he finally made his exit, slipping into the quiet luxury of his black sedan, Alexander was unsettled. Not because she had treated him badly, far from it, but because she hadn't treated him any differently than she might have treated anyone else. No flinch, no mask, just Priska Wilfred. And somehow, that was more memorable than any flirtation he'd encountered in years. He told himself it was nothing, just an unusual moment in an otherwise forgettable night. But deep down, a thought took root, stubborn and unwelcome. He wanted to see her again. Alexander Kane was not a man who looked people up. In his world, information came to him before he even thought to ask for it. About deals, about rivals, about the ebb and flow of the market. But this time, he found himself picking up the phone and dialing Daniel Whitmore 2 days after the party, his voice just a touch too casual. "Daniel," he said, "the photographer from your birthday. What's her name again?" There was a pause, and then Daniel laughed. "Alexander Kane. Are you asking about a woman?" "She was working," Alexander said shortly. "I liked her professionalism." "Uh-huh. Her name's Priska Wilfred. Freelance. She's done a couple of charity gigs for us. Lives in the city." "Why? Thinking of hiring her?" "I might," Alexander said, "for a corporate event." Daniel chuckled, clearly not buying the excuse. "I'll text you her contact info, but be warned, Priska's not like the women you're used to. She doesn't care about your bank account. And she's got this way of making you feel like she actually sees you." Alexander didn't respond. But privately, he wondered what it might feel like to be seen again. He waited 3 more days before reaching out. The Kane Corporation was hosting a private gala for one of its charitable foundations, and it was the perfect excuse to hire her. His assistant, Elaine, raised an eyebrow when he gave her the name. "Priska Wilfred," she read from her notepad. "This isn't one of your usual high-end photographers." "I'm aware," he said. "Book her." The night of the gala, Alexander arrived early. The event space, one of his own properties, was all glass and marble, the skyline glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows. Waiters glided by with trays of champagne, and a jazz trio played soft, unobtrusive music. Priska was already there, adjusting her camera settings by the bar. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked entirely focused on her work. When she saw him, she smiled. "Mr. Kane." "Priska," he said, inclining his head. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she replied. "This is a beautiful space. The light's perfect for evening shots." He watched her move through the crowd, capturing candid moments, positioning herself unobtrusively, yet always in the right place at the right time. She had a way of making people relax around her lens. No stiff poses, no forced smiles. Even he felt less guarded. Midway through the evening, she approached him during a lull. "Would you mind if I got a few shots of you?" she asked. "The host is part of the story." He gave her a wry look. You think people want to see my face? I think people want to see the person behind the event, she said simply. So he let her. And when her camera clicked, he noticed she didn't direct him to pose or tilt his head. She just let him stand as he was, her eyes meeting his between shots. When she lowered the camera, she asked quietly, "The scar, was it from an accident?" No one had asked him that in years. Most people avoided the topic entirely as though pretending not to notice would erase it. "Yes," he said after a pause. "I was 17. My fault. I hit black ice." She nodded, not flinching, not pitying. That must have been hard. It was, he admitted, surprising himself. Harder afterwards, actually. People change around you. "I know what you mean," she said softly. "Different reason, but I get it. Being a black woman in this industry, it's a constant fight to be taken seriously. People assume I'm inexperienced or that I'm only here because someone wanted diversity in the room. It's exhausting." For a moment, they just stood there in the soft hum of the gala, the conversation far too real for the setting. He found he didn't mind. Over the next few weeks, he made excuses to see her. He'd have her come to his office to photograph new developments for press releases, or ask her to shoot interiors for properties that didn't really need them. Sometimes they'd talk about the work, sometimes about nothing at all, and sometimes when the air between them felt heavy with unspoken things, he'd catch himself smiling. It wasn't just her beauty, it was her warmth, her way of making him feel less like the Ice King and more like a man who could still be worth knowing. His staff noticed the change first. "You've been in a good mood lately," Elaine remarked one morning after he breezed into the office, coffee in hand. "I'm in a good mood when business is good," he replied. But she didn't look convinced. The media noticed too. A gossip column ran a short piece titled, "Alexander Kane Seen Laughing at Charity Gala. What's behind the Ice King's smile?" He ignored it. Mostly. One evening after a long day of shooting a waterfront property, the sky opened up and rain began to fall in thick silver sheets. "Let me drive you home," Alexander said as they reached her car. "It's fine," Priska replied, glancing at her little hatchback. "I'll be okay." "I insist," he said, opening the passenger door of his Bentley. She hesitated, then relented. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows as they drove, soft jazz playing low in the background. Her apartment was in a modest but well-kept building on the edge of Harlem. She invited him up for tea, just to get you out of the rain, and he found himself stepping into a space so unlike his own. Her apartment was warm, colorful, filled with framed photographs, some professional, some clearly personal. There were books stacked on the coffee table, a plant in every corner, and the faint scent of cinnamon in the air. "This is cozy," he said, taking it in. "It's home," she replied with a small smile, handing him a mug of tea. "I like things to feel lived in." They sat on the couch, sipping tea while the rain tapped against the windows. They laughed about small things. Her disastrous attempt at cooking paella, his failed experiment in growing bonsai trees. And then, in a quiet moment, their eyes met. And for a heartbeat, he thought about leaning in. But he didn't. Instead, he finished his tea, thanked her, and left, the sound of her laughter lingering in his mind long after he'd gone. The photo hit the tabloids on a Wednesday morning. It wasn't a particularly intimate image. Just Alexander and Priska standing together outside a gallery event, his hand lightly on the small of her back as they spoke. But the headline splashed across the digital gossip site was cruel in its precision. "Beauty and the Beast. Kane's new flavor." The article was worse. Speculation about her motives, references to his scar, his reputation, his fortune. Snide jabs about social climbing and strategic romance. They'd even dug up photos from her Instagram, framing her as someone who played the long game. Priska read it once, shut the laptop, and sat in silence. It wasn't the attention itself that hurt. She had dealt with judgment before, but the thought of what this might do to Alexander. She knew how fiercely private he was. She feared that this, more than anything, might drive him back into the cold shell she'd slowly seen cracking open. Her phone stayed quiet all day. No calls, no texts from him. Alexander saw the article before she did. It had been forwarded to him by 3 different people before he'd even finished his morning coffee. He didn't click the link right away. He didn't need to. He'd seen versions of this before, though never about someone he actually cared about. When he finally opened it, something in his chest twisted. Not because the insults were new, he'd been called worse, but because they had dragged her into it. She hadn't asked for the spotlight. She hadn't asked to be associated with his name, his world, his endless parade of vultures looking for a story. And the thought that she might now be hurt, mocked, or reduced to a headline because of him was unbearable. So he did what he'd always done when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He withdrew. 2 days passed, then 5, then 2 weeks. He buried himself in work, convincing himself it was the right thing to do, that she'd be better off without him drawing more attention to her life, that whatever had been starting between them would only lead to complications she didn't deserve. But the absence was louder than any meeting, any distraction. He missed her. The quiet confidence in her voice, the way she looked at him without hesitation, the warmth of her apartment compared to the sterile emptiness of his penthouse. One night, alone in his kitchen, he found himself staring into his untouched glass of scotch, realizing he wasn't avoiding her for her sake. He was avoiding her for his own. Because wanting her meant risking something he hadn't risked in years, being seen, being known, and possibly being rejected in the ways that still haunted him, and the thought of losing her hurt far more than the thought of another headline. It was her birthday when he finally decided. He didn't send flowers through a courier. He didn't call ahead. He simply got into his car and told his driver the address he'd memorized weeks ago. Priska was at home, curled up on the couch with a book, when the knock came. She opened the door to find him standing there in a dark coat, rain clinging to his hair and shoulders. "Alexander," she said softly, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He took a breath, his voice low but steady. "I owe you an apology." She stepped aside to let him in, closing the door behind them. "You've been gone for 2 weeks. No calls. No explanation." "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted. "From the media, from my world, from me." Her brow furrowed. "You thought disappearing would protect me?" "I didn't know what else to do," he said, running a hand through his damp hair. "I've spent years keeping people at a distance because it's easier than letting them close. Easier than finding out they never wanted me. Just what I could give them." Priska's gaze softened, but she didn't step closer. "And you think I'm like that?" "No." His voice was fierce now. "That's the problem. You're the first person who's made me feel human in decades, Priska. And it terrifies me. Because if I lose you, I don't know if I can go back to the way things were before." The silence that followed was thick with things unsaid. Then she crossed the space between them, slowly, as though giving him time to pull away. "Alexander," she said gently, "you're not the sum of your scars. Not the one on your face, not the ones you keep locked up inside. I'm not afraid of them. I just need to know you won't run every time you're scared." His throat tightened. "I'll try. God, I'll try." And then she kissed him. Soft at first, then deeper, her hands framing his face as though she were holding something precious. He kissed her back, the tension in him melting like ice in sunlight. Months passed, and their lives began to intertwine in quiet, deliberate ways. He took her to gallery openings and business dinners, not as a date on his arm, but as someone whose opinion he valued. She brought him into her world too, introducing him to friends who cared nothing for his fortune, but laughed at his dry wit and sharp humor. The media didn't leave them alone, but she learned to ignore the noise, and he learned that the only opinions that mattered were the ones in the room with him. One evening in early spring, he asked her to meet him at a rooftop hotel in Manhattan, the same one where they'd first met. When she arrived, the rooftop was transformed. Lanterns hung from strings overhead, casting a warm golden glow. Flowers lined the edges of the space, and a small table for two sat in the center, draped in white linen. "This is where it started," he said when she joined him. "I remember," she replied with a smile. "I nearly destroyed my camera." He took her hands, his eyes steady on hers. "Priska, I love you." "I didn't know I was capable of saying that again, but it's true. You've changed everything for me. You've made me want to be more than the man I was." Her eyes softened. "And I love you, Alexander Kane, scar and all." They kissed under the lantern light, the city sprawling beneath them. For once, he didn't feel the weight of being watched or judged. He felt only her, the warmth of her hands, the certainty in her voice. Somewhere far below, the world kept moving, whispering, speculating. But up here, there was just them. And when he laughed, full, unrestrained, unself-conscious, Priska laughed too, the sound mingling with the hum of the city. The man no one wanted had become the man one woman truly loved. The Kane estate had never seen such a gathering. The gardens had been transformed into something out of a dream. Ivory roses climbing trellises, crystal chandeliers hanging from silken canopies, and a long aisle carpeted in white petals. An orchestra played softly in the distance, the music drifting over the crowd of the world's most powerful and celebrated. Royalty from Europe, ambassadors from across Africa, heads of global corporations, Hollywood icons in gowns worth small fortunes. It was a guest list so exclusive that the tabloids had been buzzing for weeks before the invitations had even gone out. But Alexander Kane, standing at the end of the aisle in a perfectly cut black tuxedo, saw none of them. His eyes were fixed on the woman walking toward him. Priska was radiant in a custom silk gown that seemed to float around her, the train catching the sunlight as she moved. Her veil was pinned with diamond combs, and the bouquet in her hands overflowed with white orchids and blush peonies. But more than the beauty of the dress or the flowers, it was the look in her eyes, steady, sure, filled with love, that made the breath catch in his chest. When she reached him, he took her hands and held them as if nothing else in the world existed. The ceremony was brief but perfect. They exchanged vows that were raw and personal, promises shaped by everything they had endured. When Alexander kissed her, the crowd erupted in applause and flashes from discreetly positioned photographers lit the air. The reception was a lavish affair on the estate's grand lawn. Guests dined on courses crafted by Michelin-starred chefs, drank champagne from crystal flutes, and danced beneath a canopy of stars. Alexander surprised Priska with a private performance by one of her favorite musicians, flown in from Paris for the evening. But for all the extravagance, there were moments of intimacy woven into the night, quiet glances across the table, a shared laugh when her veil got tangled in his cufflink, the way his hand never left hers for more than a moment. The honeymoon took them halfway across the world. They spent a week in the Maldives, waking to sunrises over turquoise water, their villa perched on stilts above the ocean. Days were slow and sun-warmed, swimming in hidden lagoons, dinners on the sand, conversations that drifted deep into the night. From there, they flew to Florence, where they wandered cobblestone streets and shared espresso in tiny cafes. Alexander insisted on buying her a vintage camera from a little shop near the Ponte Vecchio, saying, "So you can capture everything, except me hiding in the background." In Santorini, they watched the sun melt into the sea from a whitewashed balcony, the world below them glowing in gold and rose. Priska rested her head on his shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his, and whispered, "I think this is the happiest I've ever been." It was during their last morning in Greece that Priska told him. They had been lying in bed, the gauzy curtains billowing with the soft island breeze, when she reached for his hand and placed it over her stomach. "I think," she said with a shy smile, "we might be expecting." For a moment, he simply stared at her, the words sinking in. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his voice thick when he murmured, "You've given me everything, Priska. Everything. There was no baby yet, No nursery waiting back home, but there was the promise of a new chapter, one they would write together. Weeks later, back in New York, life returned to its rhythm, but everything felt different. Alexander still commanded boardrooms, still negotiated with the same precision, but now there was warmth in his step, a quiet smile that lingered when he thought no one was watching. And in the evenings, when the city's lights glittered against their penthouse windows, he would pour them each a cup of tea, draw her close, and rest his hand protectively over the life they had created. The man no one wanted had become the man one woman loved completely. Husband, soon-to-be father, and no longer an ice king at all. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together. With love from Whispers of Hope.